Montana Territory, 1883. The sky broke open with thunder the moment June Jennings found the two children huddled beneath her wagon. She dropped to her knees in the wet grass, her skirt soaking through, heart racing at the sight. A boy, maybe 6. A girl, no older than 4. Mud streaked their cheeks, their clothes torn and soaked, but their eyes wide, silent, scared were what nearly sent her heart to her throat. "Where's your mama?" June asked, voice soft but steady. The boy's lip trembled. "She left. Said she'd come back, but she didn't." The girl clung to her brother, saying nothing. June pressed a hand to her chest, trying to breathe through the ache rising there. "You two are safe now. I promise you that." They didn't speak again, but they didn't run either. That was enough. June got them inside the small cabin she had built with her own hands after her husband died in last year's blizzard. She wrapped them in dry quilts, poured warm milk from the stove, and only cried once quietly, in the pantry, where they couldn't see. Their names came later, Zachary and Zadie. Their mother had left them near the Bitterroot Road, told them to wait, but no one ever came back. June didn't ask more. She knew too well the kind of desperation that could drive a woman to that edge. The next morning, June hitched her mule and rode into town, not just to report the children, but to find someone who could help her. She knew she could not do this alone. She did not expect to find Victor Ashford. He stepped into the sheriff's office right as she was finishing her sentence. Tall, lean, with a rifle slung over one shoulder and dust on his boots. His eyes, sharp and gray, landed on her like he had been waiting for her all his life. "June Jennings?" he asked, voice low. She turned, puzzled. "Yes. I'm writing with the U.S. Marshal's office. Got word from Helena about a missing woman with 2 children. Been tracking her through the Bitterroot Valley." June's heart sank. "The children are with me. But the mother? She's gone." Victor's jaw tightened. "You found them? Under my wagon. Half-starved and freezing." He nodded once. "Then you saved them." She looked at him carefully. "You think you can find her?" "Maybe. But if she left them like that." He shook his head, voice flat. "I doubt she means to come back." June looked down, her hands twisting in her skirts. "They need someone." Victor glanced toward the open door, the storm still grumbling outside. "And you think that someone is you?" Her head lifted. "I know it is." He studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll help." She blinked. "Why?" "Because you're not wrong. And they need more than one person. They need a home." He did not stay in town that night. He followed her back to the cabin, riding behind her wagon through the rain-soaked hills. She did not invite him inside, but he built a fire out back and stood guard through the night anyway. The next morning, Victor fixed the broken hinge on her barn door before she could ask. Then he chopped wood until the children came out to watch. Zachary approached him first, curious. Victor handed the boy a smaller axe and showed him how to split a log. Zadie followed next, clinging to June's skirts, watching Victor with big, blinking eyes. "He's helping," June whispered to her. "He's staying a while." Zadie nodded and reached for June's hand. Her heart swelled. Over the next week, Victor stayed. June did not ask why. He helped with the animals, fixed the roof, played marbles with Zachary, and carried Zadie on his shoulders when she got tired walking to the stream. At night, he sat on the porch with June, the children asleep inside. They did not talk much, but the quiet between them was not empty. It was comforting. One night, as the fireflies blinked in the tall grass, June finally asked, "Why did you really stay?" Victor looked at her, steady and sure. "Because I know what it is to be left behind." She swallowed. "Me too." He nodded. "Then maybe neither of us has to be anymore." She looked away, blinking fast. "It's just, I did not expect this." "Me neither." The silence held between them, warm and gentle. Then Zadie cried out in her sleep, and June stood quickly, going to her. Victor followed without a word, stepping softly through the door behind her. That night, after the children settled, she found Victor standing by the window watching the rain start again. "You should not sleep on the porch in this weather," she said. "I will be fine." She hesitated, then reached for a quilt. "Then at least take this." His hand brushed hers when he took it. She did not pull away. He looked down at her, something unspoken in his eyes. "June." She met his gaze. "Yes. I am not going anywhere." She nodded, heart-thudding. I know. It was not love yet, but it was something growing, steady and strong, like roots pushing through hard earth. And for the first time in a long while, June let herself hope. Victor carried the last bucket of water from the creek just as the sun scraped low against the far hills, casting long shadows over the earth. June stood near the chicken coop, sleeves rolled to her elbows, gathering the eggs with a quiet grace that made something in his chest ache. Zachary crouched by a stump nearby, carving at a piece of wood with the small knife Victor had given him that morning. Zadie napped on a blanket under the cottonwood tree, her thumb still tucked in her mouth, curls damp from the heat of the day. Victor set the bucket down by the porch steps and wiped the back of his neck. Your boy's got a good hand with that knife. Careful, thoughtful. June didn't look up. He's always been steady. Even before. Everything. Victor nodded once. Might be worth teaching him more. If that's something you'd allow. I would. He waited a beat, then asked, You ever think about sending him to the school in town? June's hands stilled. Not yet. It's too far to walk regular, and I've yet to trust that teacher they hired from back east. She's kind but green. Doesn't know this land. Victor leaned against the porch post, watching her carefully. You thinking of keeping them here for good? She stood then, basket full, her face unreadable. I'm not thinking of letting them go. He didn't press her. Instead, he glanced toward the barn. That mare of yours, she's favoring her left hind. I can take a closer look tomorrow. June hesitated. You know horses? I worked remount stations for a spell. Fort Ellis and South down through Wyoming. Broke more horses than I can count. That leg's likely just strained, but I'll wrap it. She gave a short nod. I'd be grateful. The wind picked up just enough to rustle the drying herbs strung over the porch. June stepped up beside him, close enough he could feel the warmth of her. She smelled faintly of sage and sun-warmed linen. I haven't said thank you, she said quietly. You don't need to. I do. I was getting by before you came, but I wasn't doing right by them. Not really. He studied the horizon. You're doing more than most would have dared. She turned her face toward him. What about you? You were chasing someone when you found us. What's waiting for you past this place? Victor didn't answer right away. His jaw worked once before he said there was a woman. Down near Cheyenne. She made promises she didn't keep. June's brow lifted, but she didn't speak. She said she'd wait. But when I came back from the Powder River job, she was already married to someone else. Left me a note with a string of pearls I'd given her. I'm sorry. He shrugged. I should have known better. I was never meant for someone like her. June's voice was soft. What do you mean? She wanted white gloves and music halls. I gave her calloused hands and a mule with a bad temper. June looked at him then, really looked. She was a fool. He met her gaze. Maybe I was too. They stood in silence after that, the kind that didn't press but lingered. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the lantern burned low, June surprised him. I sent a letter last winter, she said, folding laundry beside the fire, to my cousin in Missouri. Asked if he knew of anyone looking for an arrangement. Victor turned from where he was oiling his saddle gear. Arrangement. She kept her eyes on the cloth in her hands. A man who'd marry for land and shelter. Someone honest. You were looking for a husband? Yes, but I couldn't offer much. Just this place and 2 hands that don't complain. Victor leaned forward. Did anyone answer? One man did. Said he'd come in spring. But when he arrived, he saw my face and left before supper. Victor's brow furrowed. Why? She folded the shirt slowly. I had a fever when I was a girl. Left scars across this cheek and part of my neck. He thought I'd worn a veil to trick him. Victor stared at her. Did you? No. I wore it because the wind stings when it's cold. He made up the rest. Victor sat back. You haven't worn it since I came. I haven't needed to. She met his eyes then, unflinching. Victor's voice was low, steady. He was a coward. She said nothing, but her mouth trembled just slightly before she turned back to the laundry. When the fire burned low and June rose to bank it, Victor stood too. "I'll take first watch," he said. She shook her head. "There's no need. We're safe here." He hesitated, then asked, "Do you want me to stay?" June looked at him, and for the first time, something in her expression softened in a way that made his breath catch. "I do." Victor nodded once, then stepped toward the door to check the latch. He didn't speak again, and neither did she. But when he settled on the floor near the hearth, she set an extra blanket beside him without a word. And in the quiet that followed, something between them took root, deliberate, unseen, but no less certain than dawn waiting on the other side of the dark. By mid-July, the valley had settled into its high summer hush. The days stretched long and golden, and the scent of dry grass clung to everything: shirts, hair, the low rafters of the cabin where June hung herbs to dry beside the window. The creek had narrowed to a quiet trickle, and even the chickens wandered slower in the heat. Victor stayed on. No one asked him to. No one had to. He took to rising early, before the children stirred, and splitting fence rails in the back field. June often found him there past mid-morning, shirt damp at the collar, sawdust clinging to his arms. She didn't interrupt, just brought him water and sometimes half a biscuit if he hadn't eaten. He always looked at her like she'd brought him something more than food, though he never said as much. One afternoon, Victor rode into the hills to check the trap lines he'd set for coyotes. June stayed behind with the children, teaching Zachary how to stitch a torn feed sack and letting Zadie stir the cornmeal for that night's supper. The air was thick with heat, and even the bees moved slow between the flowers planted alongside the porch. When Victor returned near dusk, he carried a satchel over his shoulder and a different look in his eyes. June stepped out to meet him, brushing flour from her hands. "Something wrong up there?" He dropped the satchel gently on the porch. "Found a campsite. Been used recently. Dry ashes, boot prints, and a scrap of calico near the waterline." She crossed her arms, brow drawn. Could it be her? Could be. But there were two prints. One larger, one smaller. June's throat tightened. "A man. Looks that way." He rested a hand against the porch rail. "I'll ride south tomorrow. See if anyone at the supply station's seen a woman like you described." June hesitated. If she's with someone now, she might not want to be found. Victor met her eyes. "That doesn't change what she left behind." June nodded slowly. "Take Zachary's old coat. Nights get cold in that pass." He looked at her longer than necessary. "You always think of everything?" "No," she said, voice quiet. "Just the things that might break if I don't." That night, after the children had been tucked in and the dishes dried, Victor sat at the edge of the porch sharpening his knife. June joined him, carrying a small jar of salve she'd made from pine pitch and bear fat. "You've got a crack along your knuckle," she said, kneeling beside him. He glanced down. "Didn't notice." "I did." She opened the jar, dipping her fingers in. "Hold still." He did. Her fingers were sure and warm. The scent of pine rose between them, mingling with the clean, dry smell of the land. She worked carefully, not speaking, and he let her. When she finished, she didn't pull her hand back right away. His skin was rough, her soft. The quiet between them grew thick again, like the air before a summer storm. "Victor," she said at last, still holding his hand, "when you came here, did you ever wonder why I didn't send you away?" He looked at her. "I figured you would if you wanted to. I didn't because I saw something in you. Not just kindness or strength, but something tired. Like you'd been carrying too much for too long, same as me." He didn't answer right away. Then, "I was angry when you first spoke to me in that sheriff's office." June frowned. "Why?" "I thought you were the woman from the letter." She blinked. "The one I sent about the arrangement?" He nodded once. "I'd gotten hold of that letter by chance. Passed through Helena right before you found the children. The marshal's clerk had a pile of mail sitting out. I read it without meaning to. The words stayed with me." June sat back slightly, eyes searching his. "And when you saw me? I thought you tricked me. That you'd worn the veil to hide something. But you hadn't." She was quiet a moment. "You believed I was ugly. I believed I'd stepped into something I didn't understand." He looked down at their joined hands. "I was wrong." She exhaled, slow and steady. "Why tell me this now?" Because I've watched you every day since. The way you care for them. The way you patch what's broken and never ask for thanks. And I've come to see that I wasn't tricked. I was given something I didn't expect. He looked up, his voice low. June, you are the most honest thing I've ever known. She didn't cry. She didn't look away. She simply reached forward and touched her palm to his cheek. You stayed, she whispered. I didn't know how not to. The screen door creaked and they turned to find Zachary standing barefoot, rubbing one eye. I heard voices, he mumbled. June stood, brushing her skirt. Just us talking. Go on back, sweetheart. Zachary hesitated, then looked to Victor. Will you be here in the morning? Victor stepped forward, squatting to the boy's height. I'll be here as long as you want me. Zachary nodded and padded back inside. June waited until the door clicked shut again. He doesn't ask for much. But when he does, it means something. Victor didn't speak, just reached out and took her hand again. And this time she let him hold it. Not because she needed saving, but because something in her had finally begun to trust that he wouldn't let go. Victor came back from the southern pass 3 days later, trail-worn and quiet. June saw from the way he held the reins, loose but watchful, that he hadn't come back empty-handed. She didn't ask. Not until Zadie fell asleep on the rug beside the hearth and Zachary took the dog out to walk the fence line. She met him on the back stoop where the air held the sharp scent of pine, dust, and old ash. She's not dead, he said without her prompting. But she's not coming back for them. June folded her hands tightly in her apron. You spoke to her? She wouldn't at first. Sat on the edge of a wagon behind a storehouse, wouldn't meet my eyes. She's with a man who works the freight line. He drinks and she's got bruises on her arms she tried to hide under a shawl. June's jaw tensed. She abandoned them. She said she thought they'd die out there. She left them because she was afraid he'd do worse if she brought them. June turned her face away, voice low. And you believed her? I believed she didn't want them to see what she'd become. They stood in silence, broken only by the faint rustle of the cottonwood leaves overhead. She signed the paper, if that's what you're wondering, Victor added. Said she'd forfeit any right to them if they had someone who'd keep them fed and loved. June looked down at her boots, caked in dust. I never wanted to replace her. You haven't. He stepped down from the stoop and set a folded paper in her hands. It's done legal. You're their guardian now. She stared at it, then whispered, they're mine. No, he said gently. They're yours and mine. If you still want that. Her hands trembled around the paper. You're asking me? I'm telling you that I've already chosen them. And you. Her eyes lifted slowly. You were angry once. Thought I tricked you. I was foolish. I thought I needed a woman who could fit into a life I no longer live. Turns out I needed one who'd build a better one with me. June's breath caught. Victor's voice softened. I still remember the first time you looked me in the eye and didn't flinch. You didn't ask me to stay, but you hoped I would. She reached for his hand slowly. I hoped you'd find what you needed here. I did. They didn't kiss. Not there. Not with the chickens settling in the coop and the dog barking somewhere near the creek. But their hands stayed joined, and that was its own kind of promise. Later that week, Victor rode into Missoula with Zachary to file the papers at the courthouse. When they returned, June had moved the old cot from the shed into the main room and laid out blankets for a second bed, tucked near the hearth. Zadie had drawn a picture in charcoal on a scrap of flour sack, 4 stick figures standing beneath a crooked sun. One of them wore a wide hat. Victor pinned it to the wall beside the window. That night, June sat beside him on the porch, her hair braided back, fingers busy with mending. She didn't look up when she said, I never had a real wedding. No preacher, no vows. Just a man who needed land and left when the snow came. Victor watched the sky, where stars had begun to push through the dusk. Would you want one now? I don't need a preacher to tell me what I already know, but I'd want something of it to be ours. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small band of tin, shaped roughly, the edges smoothed by weeks of quiet work with Zachary's carving knife. It's not much, he said, but it was yours before I even knew I was making it. June took it carefully, running her thumb along the inside. You made this. From a tobacco tin. Figured it might mean more than something bought. She slid it onto her finger and it fit snugly. Victor exhaled once, steady. "That's the second time you've given me something I didn't expect," she said. "What was the first?" "Your name." He smiled, just barely. "You wore it true before I ever said it." She leaned into him then, her shoulder brushing his. And together they watched the stars rise, the land quiet around them, the cabin behind filled with breath and warmth and the soft, certain weight of home. The first frost came late that year. Clinging to the edges of the garden rose like a whispered warning. June rose early that morning, stepping barefoot onto the porch to check the sky. The clouds hung high and light, not yet ready to spill snow, but the air bit at her skin just the same. She listened for the quiet sounds that had become her rhythm, Zadie's slow, waking breath through the open window, the creak of Victor's boots as he moved about the barn. She pulled her shawl tighter and went inside to start the fire. By the time the warmth stretched into the corners of the cabin, Zachary had come in from feeding the chickens, his cheeks pink from cold. Victor followed behind him, carrying a worn burlap sack full of potatoes and late apples. He set it down, dusted his hands off, and leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. "I passed old Cully on the trail," he said. "He asked if we'd be coming to the harvest social next week. Said they could use another fiddle." June paused mid-stir at the stove. "You play?" "Enough to keep a tune." "Haven't in a long while." She turned toward him. "Would you want to go?" Victor glanced toward the table where Zadie was drawing circles in the flour dust. "Might be good for them to see people. Hear laughter." June wiped her hands on her apron. "Then we'll go." They arrived in town the next Saturday just as the sun dipped behind the church steeple. The square had been dressed in pine garlands and orange-dyed cloth, lanterns already flickering to life along the fence rails. June wore a wool dress she'd let out at the seams to fit more comfortably, the sleeves hemmed with care. Victor had combed his hair back and wore a clean shirt she'd pressed herself. Zadie rode on his shoulders until they reached the gathering, and Zachary kept one hand on June's skirt, eyes wide at the sight of so many faces gathered at once. A woman from the mercantile offered them cider, and someone handed Victor a fiddle strung with new gut strings. He nodded once, tucked it beneath his chin, and began a slow reel that settled the crowd into a gentle sway. June watched from the edge of the square, her hands clasped, heart full of quiet astonishment. Not for the music, it was simple but sure, but for the way Victor looked at the children as they twirled near the fire-lit center, for the way the townsfolk nodded to her without hesitation now, not with pity or judgment, but with something closer to respect. She didn't dance until the final song. Victor set the fiddle aside and came to her, holding out his hand without a word. She took it. They moved in a slow circle beneath the stars, the other couples fading into shadow. His hand was warm at her back, steady. She rested her cheek near his collar, her breath catching at the closeness. "I used to think I'd have to do everything alone," she said quietly. "You don't anymore." She lifted her head. "Is that a promise?" "It's a fact." They returned home late, the children asleep in the wagon, the night crisp and clear. June carried Zadie inside, and Victor followed with Zachary, covering him with the quilt June's mother had sewn before the war. Later, they sat by the hearth with the fire low, her feet tucked beneath her, his hand resting against hers on the floorboards. "I never asked what will you do now," she said. He looked into the flames. "I've done enough chasing. I'd rather build things that last." She leaned into him. "Then stay." "I already did." They were married in December. Not in a church but beneath the cottonwood tree where Zadie had once napped, its branches bare and rising like quiet witnesses. The preacher came from town with his wife, and Zachary stood between them like a solemn guard, holding the tin ring Victor had reshaped into silver with the help of the blacksmith. June wore a shawl dyed with walnut and stitched at the edges with green thread. Victor wore the same boots he'd arrived in, newly resoled. After the vows, Zadie tugged at June's hand and whispered something into her palm. June smiled and kissed her brow. Victor didn't ask what she'd said. He didn't need to. They built a second room onto the cabin that spring, Victor laying the beams while Zachary helped set the nails. June planted rows of barley and cabbage, and Zadie spent her days with her feet in the creek, a doll tucked under one arm. Victor rode into town once a week to work part-time at the livery, not because they needed the money, but because, as he said, a man's hands ought to stay useful. He always came back before supper. By the time Zadie turned 6, they had 3 hives stacked near the back fence, a cellar full of dried fruit, and a porch swing that creaked only when the wind pushed it. At night, June and Victor often sat there, not saying much, just watching the land they'd made theirs. One evening, as the first fireflies blinked into the tall grass, Victor reached for her hand. "You think this is happiness?" he asked. She looked at him, the children's laughter echoing from the barn. "No," she said. "I think it's something better. I think it's peace." And it was. Not loud or sudden, not made of grand declarations, but made of mornings filled with sun, of shared work and steady hands, of bread rising and fences mended, of children growing sure-footed and unafraid, and of love quiet and worn in like the land that held them. Always there. Always enough.